Hey guys, welcome back to another episode. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at default parameters and template strings. So let's begin with default parameters. Let's say you have a class of document. And if you're new to the class syntax, make sure to go back to the previous lesson. In lesson number 4, we talked extensively about classes. So if you're still not comfortable with classes, make sure to go back and review that lesson. But assuming that you know classes, let's say we have a constructor here that accepts perhaps a title. And so what we're going to do is we're going to set this title to the title. Then we can create a new instance of the class. So let's say a document would be new document. The title would be my new document. And let's say we want to do a console log of the document. And of course, as you might expect, it's going to give us an object with the title of my new document. Now, let's say we wanted to have a default title for documents. So in the past with ES6, you would typically do something like this. So you would have your title, and you would basically either assign it a title, or you would assign it a default value using the two bar character symbols like so. So the default title might be something like Untitled Document, for example. So the way this example works is basically, if you provide a title for a document, it's going to use the title that's been given as the argument. Otherwise, it's basically going to use the default string. So let's say in this case, we have a document with the title, my new document, but if we remove the title, we can even remove the parentheses, it's going to give us an object with the title of Untitled Document. So that's going to be the default value. So this is the way you would typically do it in ES5. Now when it comes to ES6, you could use the new syntax for default parameters. So in this case, you might just like you would do in other languages like PHP or Ruby, you would basically put an equal sign and then you provide your value. So in this case, Untitled Document. And as you can see here, we have a document that doesn't have any argument. So it's just a simple object, and it's going to have the default title of Untitled Document. So, but if we do provide a title, it's going to use that exact value, as you can see right there. Now, when it comes to default parameters, you don't necessarily have to provide primitive values like strings. This value right here could be, for example, a method call. So let's say we have a method here. We might call it get default title, and maybe all it does is returns untitled document as a string. So you could simply do, instead of using the string right there, you could just simply call the method like so, right? And it's going to give you the same result. So here we get an object with the title of title, right? The title we provided. If we remove the argument, we're going to get an object with a default title. Now, the one important thing to keep in mind about default parameters is that those default parameters will not be available through the arguments keyword if you're dealing with functions or methods. Now, if you don't know, every single function or method in JavaScript has a built-in arguments object. And basically, that arguments object is going to contain all the arguments that the function is going to receive when it's invoked or called. So let's show this with an example of a function here. So let's say we have a function convert temperature. It's going to accept the number of degrees as well as the scale. So let's say the scale could be Celsius or Fahrenheit. Now the way it's going to work is we might have an if condition here. If the scale is Celsius, we might want to use a formula whereby we basically multiply the number of degrees by 1.8, and then we add 32 to it. Otherwise, we know we're dealing with Fahrenheit, so we want to convert from Fahrenheit to Celsius. So we're going to have something like return. We're going to subtract 32 from degrees, and then we're going to divide that by 1.8. All right. So let's call the convert temperature function. Let's do, say, 50. And we want to console log the results. Oops, a small typo right there, degrees. Okay, so that's going to give us 122. Now, so in this case, the scale becomes Celsius because that's a default parameter, right? But let's say if we provided Fahrenheit, the value would be 10. And of course, if you provided Celsius manually, it would still be 122. Now, the interesting thing is going to happen if you check the value of the arguments. So if we did console log arguments, now arguments is basically just a special keyword that refers to the built-in arguments object. As you can see right there, we get 50, which is the number of degrees that we passed, but we also get Celsius, which is a scale. Now if you provided, let's say, Fahrenheit, well, of course the object is going to have 50 and Fahrenheit, But let's say if you didn't provide the second value, so let's say if you were trying to rely on the default scale of Celsius, you would get your arguments object, but it's only going to have the number of degrees that you passed. It's not going to have the default scale. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. Now, another use case for default parameters would be when destructuring objects or arrays. So let's begin with objects. Let's say you have a function get user metadata, and I'm going to use the array syntax, and basically that function is going to return, let's say, an object. So you might have an ID, some ID, maybe you also have a name. Let's say the username would be Alex. Let's say I have a plan. We might call it basic. And lastly, let's say we have last login, and that could be some kind of a timestamp. So again, as a reminder, if you wanted, let's say, to get the name, right, the name of the object as well as the plan, in the past, well, you would do something like this. You might have a meta variable, and then you basically make a call to the get user metadata function, right? And then you have your, let's say, ID equals meta.id, and then you might have your plan equals meta.plan. Oops, plan. So you might do a console log of ID and plan. Of course, that's going to give you some ID and basic, but of course that's the older ES5 approach. In ES6, you don't have to do any of that. You could simply do let ID and plan using the curly braces, and basically just assign that to the function call metadata, like so. And that's going to give you the exact same values. So what's going to happen if you didn't have a plan on the object? So we have the same object, but we didn't have a plan. Well, in this case, we would get an ID, and we would also get undefined, and that's something you would expect, right? Because there's no plan property on the object that we return from the function. So if you wanted to have a default plan assigned to that variable, you might simply use the same exact syntax using the equal sign, and you might just say, let's say, basic. The idea might be, let's say, when you get the metadata, you want to get the ID and the plan, but if there's no plan, you just want to default to the basic plan or the free plan, whatever the case might be. So that's going to give you some ID and the basic plan as you would expect. And of course, that's also going to work with deep destructuring. If you're not sure what that means, make sure to go back to the previous lesson where we talk about destructuring in more detail. Now, the very last thing is when it comes to destructuring arrays, it's pretty much the same idea. Let's say we have a list of libraries, libs. Let's say we might have Redux, we might have Flux, and let's say lastly RxJS. So again, in the past you would do something like let's say Redux equals libs element 0. You would do Flux equals libs element 1. Of course, that would be the second element. And then you might have RxJS equals the very last element, the third one. And if you did console log Redux, Flux, and RxJS, you would get all the three libraries right there. Of course, that's the older ES5 approach. If you wanted to go ahead and use the new syntax, you would do something like this. You would do Redux, Flux, RxJS, and all of that equals to libs. And basically this syntax is going to extract all the strings in the same exact order as they show up. Now again, what happens if you didn't have the third element in the array? So let's say you only had 2. Well, of course you're going to get undefined for RxJS because there's no third element in the array, right? And basically, if you're curious, this behavior is known as fail self-destructuring. So what happens is, instead of throwing an error, JavaScript is basically going to give you the value of undefined for the third element, even though the array doesn't actually contain that element. So let's say we want to have a default value for RxJS. Well, you would pretty much use the same syntax. You would use the equal sign and then the value, the default value that you wanted to be assigned to that third argument. So in this case, as you can see, we get RxJS. As you can see, it's all pretty basic and very straightforward. Now, that's pretty much it for default parameters. Now, let's move on to template strings. So, with template strings, let's say we had some kind of markup stored in a variable. So, let's say markup equals, and then we might have some kind of a div. inside the string with a class of maybe container. And let's say inside of the div we have some kind of a title, right, with a closing tag, and maybe also with a class of title. Now this is kind of hard to read, so let's say you wanted to predefine this. So you wanted to have your title to be on the second line, maybe the closing div tag you want it to be on another line, and then maybe you wanted your title like so, just so that it looks nicer. Of course that's not going to work and you're going to get an error. In fact, if you check the DevTools, you're going to see a reference error right there. Now that happens because we don't have a closing quote right there. So one way to solve this would be to continue using single quotes. So we close that, add a plus sign, and then we're going to have a second string right there. We're going to close it, add a plus sign. The same thing for the title, because that's also a string. We're going to close the h1 tag with a plus sign, and lastly the div, like so. Let's say we wanted to console log markup, and that's going to give us the original value. Another way to handle this would be to use backslashes. So instead of using the plus sign and the closing quote, you might just put a backslash like so. Same thing right there. Don't need any more quotes. Let's fix that. No more plus sign, like so. And that should be it. We should get the same value like so. Of course, now we get spaces in between because we have new lines and whatnot. But that's perfectly valid and it's going to work. And then the very last thing you could do is you could also go back to having the same opening and closing quotes, like so. You don't need any more backslashes. Basically just going to close all of that, like that. So the other technique would be to treat these single strings as array elements. So you might simply make them array elements and separate them by commas, like so, right? And then you close your array. So that's going to give you an array. So to make it a string, you might simply call join with an empty string right there, and that's going to give you the same result as before. But of course, this is much easier in ES6, and ES6 introduces the backticks. So what they do is they basically allow you to have a string. So notice here, I'm going to put the backticks at the very beginning and the very end of the string. I'm going to remove all the other quotes inside of it, like so, all the commas. We don't need any of that. And it's going to give us the exact same result, except you also see the spacing, right? You see the new lines and whatnot. So what the backticks allow us to do is to basically split the string into multiple lines. And the other cool thing is, let's say the title of the h1 tag was dynamic. So let's say it was stored in a variable. We might call it title, my title. And what if you wanted to put that title inside of the h1 tag? Well, in the past, if you were dealing with single quotes, double quotes, and whatnot, you would basically have to put your argument between the quotes. So you would have to close the previous string. So in this case, let's say we're using the backticks. You might want to reach out to the old method of basically closing the string, putting the plus sign, putting your title, and then another plus sign. Of course, that's going to work. You're going to get the title inside of it. But with the backticks, you don't have to reach out to the same old approach as you would do with single quotes or double quotes. You can put your variable right directly inside of the string using the $sign and then the curly braces. And then you just simply put your title variable inside of it. And you're going to get the exact same result as before. Of course, you're not limited to variables. You could also put expressions. So you might do some math inside of it. You could also call functions, get, user metadata as we had before. This could be a function call. This could be equal to a method of a class or an object. It really depends. There's a lot of flexibility with this new syntax. But in this simple example, we're just going to stick to the title. And that's going to give us the markup with the title inside of it. So that's about it for default parameters and template strings. Thank you so much for checking out this video. We have a lot more in the way, and I'm going to see you in the very next one.